Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. They say every October the rules appear on trees throughout Salem woods, carved fresh into the bark like wounds that won't heal. Nobody knows who puts them there, and honestly, nobody wants to find out. But here's the thing that'll make your skin crawl. The rules change every year, except for one. Rule number 7, it's always the same, and it's the only one that matters year-round. Before I tell you this story, let me ask you something. When was the last time you truly felt safe in the dark? Because after tonight, you might never feel that way again. Hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear what happened to me last October, and stick around till the end, because what I'm about to tell you, it'll change how you see every shadow, every unexplained noise, every moment are alone. Alright, the story is about to begin now. Part 1, The Invitation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I moved to Salem, Massachusetts 3 years ago for a job at the local library. I'd always been drawn to New England's history, the autumn leaves, the small town charm. What I didn't expect was to become obsessed with Salem woods. It started innocently enough. Every morning, I'd grab my pumpkin spice latte from Brew and Broom Cafe on Essex Street, then take the trail that wound through Salem woods to reach the library's back entrance. It saved me 15 minutes, and those October mornings, with mist clinging to the red and gold leaves, they were magical. The woods themselves seemed almost alive in those early days. Ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches overhead like cathedral arches, and the morning light filtered through in golden shafts that made dust motes dance like fairy lights. I'd often pause at the small wooden bridge that crossed Willow Creek, listening to the gentle babble of water over stones, breathing in the crisp air that smelled of damp earth and decomposing leaves. There was something almost addictive about that walk. The way my footsteps on the packed dirt trail seemed to echo with purpose. The way squirrels would chatter overhead, seemingly welcoming my daily passage. Even the crows, usually harsh and ominous, felt like friendly sentries watching over my commute. I'd started bringing my camera those first few weeks, capturing the changing seasons. October brought the most spectacular transformation, maples blazing scarlet, birches dropping golden coins of leaves, and the evergreens providing deep green contrast. I must have taken hundreds of photos, though looking back now, something always felt off about them. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be. Sometimes I'd notice shapes in the background that I didn't remember seeing when I took the shot. The locals were friendly but weird about the woods. Mrs. Henderson from the cafe would always say, "Beautiful morning for a walk, dear, just stick to the main path." Mr. Chen at the corner store would nod knowingly when I mentioned my route, adding, "Smart girl, daylight hours only." At first, I attributed their warnings to typical small-town superstition. Salem, after all, thrived on its spooky reputation. Every corner had a ghost tour, every building claimed some connection to the witch trials. I figured the woods were just another piece of local folklore, something to add mystique for the tourists who descended every October. But there were other signs I ignored. The way conversations would stop when I mentioned my morning walks. How certain longtime residents would cross themselves when passing the wood's entrance. Mrs. Ashworth, who lived in the Victorian house closest to the trail, kept iron horseshoes nailed above every door and window facing the forest. When I asked her about it during a neighborhood barbecue, she just smiled tightly and said, "Old habits, dear. Old habits die hard." I thought they were just being typical New Englanders, reserved and cryptic, until I met Jake. Jake Thornton worked at the Historical Society next to the library. Tall, lanky, with that kind of nervous energy that made him fidget with his Red Sox cap constantly. We'd gotten friendly over lunch breaks, bonding over true crime podcasts and local ghost stories. Jake was different from the other locals. Where they were evasive about the woods, he seemed genuinely curious about them. He'd pepper me with questions about my walks. Did I ever see anything unusual? Hear strange sounds? Feel like I was being watched? At the time, I thought he was just another transplant like me, fascinated by Salem's supernatural reputation. He'd grown up in Salem, he told me, but left for college and only returned the previous year to help care for his aging grandfather. The old man lived in a rambling house on Chestnut Street, filled with local artifacts and newspaper clippings dating back generations. Jake would sometimes share stories from his grandfather's collection, tales of strange lights in the woods, people who went missing during October, unexplained sounds that seemed to follow certain walkers home. "My grandfather says Salem woods are older than the town," Jake told me one day, unwrapping his sandwich with hands that shook slightly. "He says the Puritans chose to settle here despite the woods, not because of them. Something about the trees, they've always been different." I found his stories entertaining, like listening to a really good campfire tale. I never suspected they were warnings. It was October 15th when everything changed. "Sarah, you walk through Salem woods every day, right?" Jake asked, picking at his sandwich. "Yeah, why?" "Why?" He glanced around the empty break room, then leaned closer. "Have you seen them yet?" "The rules? What rules?" His eyes widened. "You seriously haven't noticed. They appear every October carved into 7 specific trees along the main trail." "The Salem Woods rules," I laughed. "Come on, Jake. Is this another one of your urban legends?" "I'm serious." He pulled out his phone, showing me a blurry photo of tree bark with words carved deep into it. "Look, I took this yesterday." I squinted at the screen. The carving was crude but clear. Rule 3. If you hear your name called, do not answer. It's not who you think. A chill ran through me, but I played it off. Probably just teenagers messing around. Jake shook his head vigorously, his cap slipping forward over his eyes. "Sarah, these have been appearing for decades. My grandfather told me about them. Different rules each year except..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Except for Rule 7. The way he said it made my coffee taste suddenly bitter." There was something in his voice, not just fear but recognition, like he was talking about something he'd experienced firsthand. "Which is?" "Nobody talks about Rule 7, his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But it's the only one that applies year-round, the only one that really matters." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. The nervous energy I'd always attributed to caffeine now seemed more like barely contained panic. His fingers drummed constantly on the table, and when he thought I wasn't looking, he'd glance out the window toward the woods with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jake, you're starting to creep me out. What's really going on here?" He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with himself. Finally, he spoke, his words coming in a rush. 3 years ago, when I first came back to Salem, I didn't believe any of my grandfather's stories. I thought they were just, old man nonsense. So I went looking for the rules myself. Found 6 of them, just like you will. But Rule 7, he shuddered. Rule 7 finds you when you're ready to understand what the woods really are. And what are they really? "Hungry," he whispered. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on cataloging books. My mind kept drifting to Jake's words. Finally, at 4:30, I decided to leave early and check out these supposed rules myself. The afternoon had grown unseasonably warm for mid-October, but as I approached the wood's entrance, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The cheerful autumn colors I'd admired that morning now looked somehow muted, as if a filter had been placed over everything. Even the sounds were different. The usual chatter of squirrels and rustle of small animals through the underbrush had faded to an almost oppressive quiet. The autumn sun was already low, painting everything orange and shadow. I entered Salem Woods from the usual spot, where the iron gate stood permanently open, its hinges frozen with rust. The gate itself was older than I'd ever really noticed before. Victorian ironwork, elaborate and beautiful, but also somehow menacing. At the top, worked into the decorative scrolls, were symbols I couldn't identify, not quite Celtic knots, not quite Native American designs, but something that seemed to combine elements of both. The metal was black with age and weather, except for certain spots that looked almost polished, as if many hands had touched them over the years. 20 steps in, I found the first tree. The carving was fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds in the bark. My fingers trembled as I traced the words. Rule 1. The woods remember everything, your secrets, your sins, your promises. Be careful what you bring with you. My rational mind said vandalism. But something deeper, more primal, whispered otherwise. The tree itself was massive, easily 3 feet in diameter, with bark so deeply grooved it looked like ancient armor. But it was the carving that made my breath catch. The letters weren't just cut into the bark, they seemed to pulse with their own life, the edges darker than the surrounding wood, as if they'd been burned rather than carved. I found myself running my fingers over the words, feeling the rough texture of the cuts. The wood was warm, warmer than it should be in the cooling October air, and as I touched it, I could have sworn I felt something, a vibration, like a heartbeat deep within the tree. I found the second tree 50 yards further. Rule 2. Never follow the lights between the trees. They lead nowhere you want to go. This carving was different. The letters seemed to shimmer, catching what little light filtered through the canopy and throwing it back in strange patterns. As I read the words, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Small points of light, dancing between the distant trees like oversized fireflies. They pulsed gently, hypnotically, and I found myself taking a step toward them before the rule's warning stopped me cold. The third tree was the one Jake had photographed. The fourth made my stomach turn. Rule 4. If you find something that belongs to someone else, leave it. The woods don't give, they trade. By the time I reached the 5th tree, the sun was touching the horizon. The words seemed to pulse in the dying light. Rule 5. Trust the crows. When they go silent, you should leave. I realized then that I hadn't heard a crow since entering the woods. The thought made my skin crawl. I almost turned back then. Almost, but curiosity, that dangerous human trait, pushed me forward. The sixth tree stood in a small clearing. Its message was longer, more urgent. Rule 6. Between sunset and sunrise, stay on the path. What lives off the trail has different rules, ones you're not meant to learn. My heart was pounding now. One more tree, one more rule. Rule 7, the O, nay that mattered year-round. But as I searched, the forest grew darker. The cheerful afternoon woods transformed into something else, something waiting. The crows that had been chattering all day fell silent. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. I turned and ran. But even as I fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me go. Not with malevolence exactly, but with patience. Like it knew I'd be back. And deep down, I knew it was right. Part 2. The investigation that night. I barely slept. Every shadow at my apartment window looked like reaching branches. Every settling noise sounded like footsteps on dead leaves. I lived in a converted Victorian on Federal Street, with tall windows that faced east toward the woods. I'd always loved those windows. They let in beautiful morning light and gave me a perfect view of the changing seasons. But that night, they felt like vulnerabilities. The old glass was wavy and distorted, making the shadows outside shift and dance in ways that kept catching my eye. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, not just the window latches, but the front door, the back door, even the basement entrance I never used. It was irrational. What was I afraid of? Trees walking down Federal Street? But rationality had little power against the primitive fear that had taken root in my chest. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and made coffee, settling at my kitchen table with my laptop. If I couldn't sleep, I might as well research. But every time I tried to focus on the screen, my eyes would drift to those windows, scanning the darkness beyond for shapes that didn't belong. The next morning, I confronted Jake before the library opened. I saw them, I said, clutching my coffee like a lifeline. 6 rules, but I couldn't find the 7th. Jake's face paled. You went looking for Rule 7? Sarah, nobody goes looking for Rule 7? It finds you when... He stopped, shaking his head. When what? When you've broken it. But how can I break a rule I don't know? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own coffee cup as if the answers might be floating in the cream. Then, my grandfather, he knew someone who found Rule 7 once, back in 1973, guy named Tommy Brennan. What happened to him? He disappeared for 3 days. When he came back, he wouldn't talk about it. Just kept saying, I didn't know, moved to California a week later, never came back to Salem. The way Jake said Tommy's name made me pay closer attention. There was familiarity there and something else. Guilt, maybe. I filed the observation away for later. I should have left it alone, should have started taking the long way to work, but that night, I did something stupid. I researched. The Salem Library has archives going back to the 1600s. In the restricted section, I found references. Scattered mentions in old newspapers, diary entries, police reports, working by lamplight in the library's basement archive, I felt like I was conducting an archaeological dig through Salem's collective memory. The oldest references were in handwritten journals, their pages yellow and brittle. Later entries appeared in typed police reports and newspaper clippings, the paper quality improving with each decade, but the stories remaining eerily consistent. 1891, 7 trees marked with warnings. Locals refused to enter woods after dark. 1924, missing child found unharmed after 3 days. Claims she followed the rules. 1957, unexplained carvings appear annually. Police investigation yields no suspects. 1973, Thomas Brennan, 24, rapport. Ted missing, found disoriented near Salem Woods entrance. But the pattern went deeper. Every October for over a century the rules appeared, and every few years someone disappeared. Most came back. Most. The police reports were particularly disturbing. Missing persons cases that resolved themselves just as mysteriously as they began. People found wandering the streets of Salem with no memory of where they'd been, or with memories so outlandish the authorities dismissed them as trauma-induced fantasies. But the details were consistent across decades: lost time, confusion about dates, and recurring nightmares about walking through endless forests. Many of the returned missing persons left Salem within weeks of their reappearance, never to be seen again. I photographed everything, building a timeline on my laptop. The rules changed each year, but certain themes repeated. Don't trust the lights, listen to the animals, stay on the path, and always, always, references to a 7th rule that nobody would document. The more I dug, the more I realized how extensive the cover-up was. News articles would mention the disappearances in detail, then follow up with brief paragraphs about the person being found safe with no explanation of where they'd been or what had happened. Police reports were similarly vague, filled with bureaucratic language that said nothing while appearing to say everything. But the pattern was clear. Salem woods were a predator, and October was feeding time. October 20th arrived gray and drizzling, perfect weather for bad decisions. I called in sick and prepared for a full investigation: flashlight, camera, portable phone charger, trail mix, water. I even brought salt, because why not? I also brought something else, a small digital voice recorder I'd borrowed from the library's audiovisual collection. If something happened to me, if I disappeared like the others, maybe someone would find it and understand what the woods really were. This time I started at dawn. The woods felt different in the morning rain, older, like they'd dropped their friendly mask. I documented each rule again, taking clear photos. But this time I noticed something. Each tree with a rule had a small symbol carved above it, a circle with 7 lines radiating out, like a child's drawing of the sun, but wrong somehow. The symbols were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. But once I noticed the first one, they became impossible to ignore. They weren't fresh like the rules. These carvings were old, weathered, possibly decades old. The lines weren't quite straight, and the circle wasn't quite round, giving each symbol a hand-drawn, almost organic quality. But it was their placement that disturbed me most. They were positioned exactly at eye level, as if whoever had carved them wanted them to be seen. Wanted them to be noticed by someone who was paying attention. Following the pattern, I triangulated where the 7th tree should be, off the trail. Rule 6 screamed in my mind. What lives off the trail has different rules, but I stepped off anyway. The transition from maintained trail to wild forest was more dramatic than I'd expected. The Park Service kept the main paths clear and well marked, but just 20 feet into the undergrowth, I felt like I was entering true wilderness. The trees grew closer together here, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the gray morning light. The undergrowth was thicker here, untouched by the Park Service. My jeans caught on thorns, branches grabbed at my hair. But 30 feet in I found it, an ancient oak, wider than my apartment, and carved into it not just words but hundreds of them, names and dates going back decades, maybe centuries. This tree was different from the others. Massive beyond anything I'd seen in New England, it seemed to radiate age and presence. Its trunk was scarred with countless carvings, layer upon layer of human desperation etched into its bark. Names, dates, pleas for help, warnings to stay away, all carved by hands that had found this place before me. Some of the names I recognized from my research: Tommy Brennan, 1973, Margaret Walsh, 1958, Jonathan Pierce, 1934. Others were so old the bark had grown around them, making them barely legible. But in the center, fresher than the rest, was Rule 7. Rule 7. The woods are always listening. Every step you take, every word you speak, every thought you think on this trail becomes part of the forest. This rule never expires. You entered Salem Woods. You're already playing. Below it, in smaller letters, "Welcome to the game." My phone died instantly, not powered down, dead. The screen cracked without me dropping it, and then I heard it, my name, Sarah, soft, like wind through leaves, but unmistakably my name. Rule 3 crashed through my memory. If you hear your name called, do not answer. I bit my tongue till it bled, forcing silence. Sarah Mitch. Closer now, and it sounded exactly like Jake. I turned to run back to the trail, but the undergrowth had changed. Where I'd pushed through moments before, solid thorn bushes stood, ancient, undisturbed. The only path led deeper into the woods. And that's when I realized the terrible truth. I hadn't found Rule 7 by accident. I'd been led here. Every step of my investigation, every clue I'd followed, every choice I'd made, it had all been guided by something that knew exactly how curious I was, exactly how stubborn I could be when I set my mind to something. The woods hadn't just been listening to my morning walks. They'd been learning how to trap me. The game had begun 3 years ago with my first step on the trail, and now, finally, it was time to play. Part 3. The game panic is a funny thing. It makes you stupid and sharp at the same time. I couldn't think straight, but I noticed everything. The way the rain stopped hitting me, though I could still hear it. The way my footprints disappeared the moment I lifted my foot. The way the trees seemed to lean in, listening. The forest around me had transformed into something that defied natural law. Paths appeared and disappeared based on some logic I couldn't grasp. The undergrowth seemed to part before me in some directions while becoming impenetrable walls in others. It was like being inside a living maze, one that rearranged itself based on my intentions. I walked for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes. Time worked differently here. My watch had stopped at 7:43 a.m. the moment I'd found Rule 7. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything became. The trees grew in impossible configurations, roots growing upward, branches disappearing into the ground, bark that seemed to shift and ride when I wasn't looking directly at it. The air itself felt thick, almost syrupy, making each breath an effort. And everywhere, carved into every available surface, were more names, hundreds of them, thousands. Some recent enough that I could smell the fresh sap, others so old they might have been carved before Columbus reached America. A catalog of every soul who had played this game and lost. Then I saw the light, soft, golden, warm, dancing between the trees like a firefly made of sunset. Everything in me wanted to follow it. Rule 2. Never follow the lights between the trees. The light pulsed gently, hypnotically, and I found myself understanding why people had followed them for centuries. It wasn't just beautiful, it was welcoming. It promised warmth, safety, answers to questions I didn't even know I had. Following it felt less like a choice and more like coming home. I closed my eyes and walked in the opposite direction. Behind me, I heard something like disappointment or hunger. The sound that followed my refusal was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part wind, part whisper, part animal growl. It was the sound of something ancient being denied a meal it had been promised. When I opened my eyes, I was in a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center sat a backpack, modern, bright blue with a Columbia University patch. Rule 4 whispered, "If you find something that belongs to someone else, leave it." But as I stepped around it, I saw the wallet on the ground. My wallet, the one in my pocket. I checked. My pocket was empty. The woods don't give, they trade. Standing there, staring at my own possessions arranged like bait in a trap, I finally began to understand what I was dealing with. This wasn't some supernatural force operating on alien logic. It was something much more calculating. The woods weren't just ancient, they were intelligent. They understood human psychology better than most humans did. They knew I would need my wallet. They knew I would break Rule 4 to retrieve something that belonged to me. And they knew that breaking the rules would give them more power over me. I had to make a choice, take my wallet and leave the backpack, or leave both. But what would happen if I left my wallet here? What would the woods do with something that belonged to me? That's when I noticed the crows, dozens of them, silent in the trees, watching. When had they gone quiet? Had they been quiet this whole time? The crows were wrong too. They perched on branches that shouldn't have been able to support their weight, and their eyes reflected light that wasn't there. Some of them seemed to have too many wings, or wings that moved independently of their bodies. Others appeared to be carved from wood themselves until they blinked or turned their heads to track my movement. Sarah, this time it sounded like my mother who lived in Arizona, my mother whose voice I knew better than my own. "Sarah, sweetie, I'm lost. Help me." The voice was perfect. The voice was every intonation, every slight accent, every emotional nuance. It was exactly how my mother sounded when she was scared and trying not to show it. If I hadn't known with absolute certainty that my mother was 3,000 miles away, I would have answered without hesitation. I almost answered. My mouth opened, but I bit down hard, tasting blood again. The voice laughed, not my mother's laugh, something older pretending. When the laughter faded, it was replaced by other voices. My father, dead for 10 years, asking why I never visited his grave. My college roommate, wondering where I'd hidden her jewelry before she moved out. My sister, demanding to know why I'd told everyone her secret. Voices from every guilty moment of my life, every regret, every shame I'd carried in my heart. The woods hadn't just been listening to my thoughts during those morning walks, they'd been cataloging my emotional vulnerabilities, building an arsenal of psychological weapons to use against me. I grabbed my wallet and ran. Behind me, I heard the backpack being dragged through leaves. But I didn't look back. As I ran, the voices followed. They came from every direction now, echoing through the impossible forest, calling my name, making accusations, pleading for help. And underneath them all was another sound, footsteps. Dozens of pairs of footsteps, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran. The path appeared suddenly, not the same place I'd left it, but the main trail nonetheless. I recognized the 6th tree, its rules still fresh, but the sun was setting. How? It had been morning. How? Early morning, my watch still showed 7:43. The temporal displacement was the final confirmation that I was no longer operating within normal reality. Time moved at the wood's discretion here, bending to serve purposes I could barely comprehend. Morning had become evening in the space of what felt like minutes, but might have been hours, or days, or years. I ran toward the entrance, but the trail stretched. Every step I took, it grew longer. The iron gate stayed the same distance away. It was like running on a treadmill designed by a sadistic god. The familiar landmarks, the bridge over Willow Creek, the interpretive sign about local wildlife, the bench where elderly dog walkers often rested, all remained exactly the same distance ahead of me no matter how hard I pushed myself. The crows exploded from the trees, hundreds of them screaming. Their cries weren't normal crow calls, they were human screams, distorted by avian vocal cords. Screams of terror, of pain, of people who had realized too late what game they were playing. The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony of centuries of human suffering given voice through the throats of carrion birds. And then silence, dead, complete silence. Even my footsteps made no sound. The silence was worse than the screaming. It was the sound of a held breath, of something waiting to pounce. In that perfect quiet, I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, my own breathing, the whisper of my clothes as I moved. I felt exposed, like a mouse in an empty field knowing the hawk circles overhead. The woods hadn't just been listening, they'd been learning me, my fears, my logic, my patterns. This was the game, and I'd been playing since my first walk through Salem Woods 3 years ago. Every morning commute, every casual stroll, the woods had been taking notes. I stopped running, stood completely still, and spoke for the first time since finding Rule 7. I know you're listening, my voice sounded wrong, older. I know the rules now, all 7, but there's an 8th rule, isn't there? The one nobody writes down. The silence deepened, if that was possible, like the world holding its breath. The 8th rule is that the rules don't save you, I continued. They're not warnings. They're instructions, for the game. A wind that touched nothing else moved through the clearing, and carved into the tree beside me, fresh words appeared. Clever girl, clever good. But clever isn't enough. You've been ours since your first step on this trail. 3 years of morning walks, 3 years of thoughts and dreams and secrets. We know you, Sarah Mitchell. We know what you did in Phoenix. My blood froze. Phoenix, the reason I'd really left Arizona. The accident that wasn't quite an accident. The thing I'd never told anyone, never written down, only carried in my mind. But I'd thought about it, on these trails, during those peaceful morning walks. I'd thought about it constantly. The memory hit me like a physical blow. David Martinez, crossing the street outside the university library. The screech of brakes that came just a moment too late. The impact that sent him flying 20 feet. The way he looked at me as the paramedics worked over him, confusion and pain in his eyes. And my moment of hesitation. That split second when I could have braked sooner, swerved harder, honked my horn to warn him. The moment when some dark part of me, the part that remembered him laughing when I dropped my books, the part that still burned with embarrassment over his rejection, made me wait just a heartbeat too long. That's the real Rule 7, isn't it? I said, the woods are always listening to everything, even thoughts, especially thoughts. The words carve themselves. And now, Sarah, It's time to trade, the tree continued carving itself, the letters appearing with wet, organic sounds. We offered you 3 years of beauty, 3 years of peace, 3 years of morning walks to ease your guilt. Now the debt comes due. I realized then that my daily walks hadn't been coincidence. The woods had been calling to me since the day I arrived in Salem, offering the exact psychological comfort I needed. The peace I found on those morning trails had been a drug, carefully administered to keep me coming back, to keep me feeding them my thoughts and memories and guilt. I had been livestock, fattened on false serenity, ready for harvest. Part 4, the trade. The forest changed around me, not dramatically, subtly. Trees I'd passed every day for 3 years showed their true faces. Ancient things that had stood before Salem existed, before humans gave this place a name. I noticed paths I'd never seen, leading off in impossible directions, and on each tree more rules, hundreds of them. Different languages, different centuries, all basically saying the same thing. We tried to warn you. The transforming forest revealed itself like a photograph developing in reverse. The quaint New England woodland I'd loved dissolved to show something far more primordial underneath. These trees predated not just Salem, but possibly human presence in North America altogether. Their bark was scarred with symbols from cultures I couldn't identify, languages that might have been spoken when the continental ice still covered New York. And everywhere, etched in dozens of scripts and tongues, were variations of the same desperate warnings. Turn back. Don't trust the voices. The price is too high. They never let you go. What do you want? I asked the darkness. Words carved themselves into the ground at my feet, burning like embers. You took a life in Phoenix. The woods demand balance. It was an accident, but even as I said it, I knew they knew better. It hadn't been murder, but it hadn't been completely accidental either. That moment of hesitation before hitting the brakes, that split second of wanting someone gone, the woods know the weight of intention. New words appeared. You carried debt. We offer trade. The carved letters glow. wed with their own phosphorescence, casting sickly green light across the clearing. As I watched, more words appeared, burning themselves into tree trunks, into fallen logs, into the very earth beneath my feet. Every thought you've carried here, every walk you've taken, every morning you came to us seeking peace, you knew the cost. Part of you always knew. And with horrible clarity, I realized they were right. Some buried part of me had understood from the beginning that my morning sanctuary was too perfect, too healing, too exactly what I needed. No place offered such precise emotional comfort without expecting payment. What kind of trade? The forest rustled, and suddenly I could see them, other people, translucent, walking the trails. Some in modern clothes, some in outfits from decades past, all with the same hollow look. They moved through the trees like sleepwalkers, following paths that twisted through dimensions I couldn't perceive. Their faces were empty of everything except a terrible awareness. They knew where they were, knew what had happened to them, but were powerless to change it. As I watched, I recognized some of them from the photos in my research. Tommy Brennan, looking exactly as he must have in 1973, walked past without seeing me. Margaret Walsh, the missing child from 1924, skipped along a path that led straight up the trunk of an oak tree. Jonathan Pierce from 1934 sat on a bench that flickered in and out of existence, staring at a pocket watch that ran backwards. 3 days a year, the words burned brighter, every October, 3 days walking our trails. Feeding us your thoughts, your memories, your essence, do this and your debt is paid. For how long? Until the debt is cleared, 7 years for a life taken in anger. But yours was taken, in a moment's hesitation, 3 years. I've already been walking here for 3 years. Those were freely given, the trade starts now. The distinction hit me like a slap. All those morning walks, all those peaceful interludes I'd treasured, they had been free samples. Bait. The woods had been letting me taste what they offered, getting me addicted to the serenity they could provide before presenting the bill. I wanted to run, but where? The woods knew where I lived, where I worked. They knew my thoughts, and if I refuse. And if... The translucent figures turned toward me, and I recognized one, Tommy Brennan, looking exactly as he must have in 1973. Then you stay. His mouth didn't move, but I heard his voice, forever walking, forever feeding the woods, never leaving, never dying, just existing. His voice carried the weight of decades of regret. I could hear in it the echo of every choice he wished he could take back, every moment when he might have chosen differently but didn't. Why October? I asked, stalling, thinking, the veil is thin. The ground replied, October in Salem, when belief and disbelief dance together. When tourists come seeking thrills and locals lock their doors. The perfect time to harvest. The carved words pulsed with each syllable, and I began to understand the deeper mechanics of what I was facing. Salem's reputation, its commercialized supernatural identity, wasn't just tourist exploitation, it was camouflage. The real supernatural forces used the town's theatrical spookiness as cover, hiding in plain sight among the fake ghost tours and manufactured scares. October was when the boundary between worlds grew thin, but it was also when thousands of people descended on Salem expecting to be frightened. Real disappearances could be dismissed as publicity stunts gone wrong. Genuine supernatural encounters could be written off as elaborate hoaxes. The woods had evolved to use human skepticism as their greatest weapon. That's when I noticed something. My phone, the one that had died and cracked, was recording impossible, but the red light blinked steadily. The device in my hand shouldn't have been functional. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, the battery dead, the internal circuits likely fried by whatever force had killed it earlier. Yet somehow, impossibly, it was capturing everything. The red recording indicator pulsed like a heartbeat, documenting my conversation with forces that shouldn't exist. The woods noticed too. The carved words started coming faster, overlapping. Keter rule breaker. The game is over. You belong to us, no. Trees throughout the clearing began carving themselves simultaneously, the sounds of splintering bark creating a cacophony like a dozen chainsaws. Letters appeared on every surface, threatening, angry, desperate. The forest was losing control of its carefully orchestrated game, and its response was pure rage. But then I remembered something Jake had said, about his grandfather's friend. Tommy came back. He was found. Wait! I shouted. Tommy Brennan got out. He left Salem. The forest grew still. He made a different trade. Tommy's ghost whispered. I offered them something more valuable than 3 days a year. What? A replacement. He looked right at me. I sent my younger brother here, told him about a shortcut through the woods. He walks here still, every October, forever. Horror washed over me, but also terrible understanding. The ghost of Tommy Brennan flickered as he spoke, his form becoming more solid as his shame deepened. I could see the family resemblance now, the same nervous fidgeting, the same way of adjusting his cap when uncomfortable, features I recognized from someone I'd trusted. That's what Jake was trying to do, I breathed. Send me to find Rule 7, make me the replacement. The woods laughed. A sound like wind through 1,000 trees. Clever girl sees the pattern, new words carved, everyone who escapes sends another. The trade continues. The woods are always fed, the laughter died away, replaced by something that might have been admiration. The forest had been playing this game for centuries, refining its methods, learning from each victory and defeat. I was just the latest in a long line of people who thought they could outwit something that had been manipulating human psychology since before written language. But I didn't try to escape, I came looking. Silence. Then, slowly. True, you sought us out. This changes things. The translucent figures faded. The impossible paths closed. And suddenly I could see the iron gate. Close, real. The forest was reconsidering its position. In all its centuries of operation, it had grown accustomed to hunting reluctant prey. People who stumbled onto the trails by accident, or those lured by false promises. But I had come searching for the truth. I had violated its careful game by refusing to play the role of victim. Choose. Final words carved into the earth. 3 days a year for 3 years, or send another in your place. You have until midnight. The forest released me. I stumbled out onto Essex Street, where concerned faces surrounded me. My phone showed 8 p.m. I'd been gone 13 hours. The transition from supernatural forest to mundane Salem Street was jarring. Car horns, streetlights, the smell of exhaust and fried food from nearby restaurants, normal human sensations that felt alien after my time in the woods. The people gathered around me looked wrong somehow, too solid, too real, their concerns too simple and immediate. Jake was there, trying to look worried, but I saw the relief when he realized I'd made it out. Sarah, we've been looking everywhere. Are you okay? I stared at him. This man I trusted, who'd tried to feed me to the woods, his performance was perfect, the worried colleague, the concerned friend. If I hadn't spoken to his brother's ghost, if I hadn't understood the true mechanics of the wood's hunger, I might have fallen for it. But I could see through his act now. The slight tremor in his hands wasn't from worry about my well-being. It was from fear that his plan had failed. I know what you did, I whispered. His face crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But it was you or me, and my 3 years are almost up. Just one more October after this one. Who did you replace? My cousin. Tears ran down his face. She never came back. She's one of the permanent ones now. The confession poured out of him in a rush. How he'd moved back to Salem not to care for his grandfather, but because the woods had summoned him. How his 3-year debt was almost paid, but only if he could find someone to take his place. How he'd spent months cultivating our friendship, learning my psychology, preparing me to be the perfect sacrifice. I chose you because you were already carrying guilt, he sobbed. The woods told me, they said you'd be easier to catch because part of you wanted to be punished. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so fucking sorry. I had 4 hours to decide, trade 3 days of my life for 3 years, or condemn someone else. The weight of the choice pressed down on me like a physical force. 4 hours to decide between accepting a supernatural punishment that might be bearable, or destroying another innocent life to save myself. 4 hours to determine what kind of person I really was. I wish I could tell you I made the noble choice, that I accepted my punishment with grace. But I'd already taken one life through hesitation. What was another through intention? The thought came to me with crystal clarity, cutting through the moral fog like a blade. I had killed David Martinez through a moment's hesitation, a split-second decision to let physics take its course rather than fight harder to prevent the collision. Now I was facing the same choice on a larger scale, act to save myself, or let events unfold naturally and accept the consequences. But this time, action meant deliberately condemning someone else. This time, hesitation was the moral choice. I made a phone call to my ex in Phoenix, the one who'd been in the car with me that night, the one who'd helped cover up what really happened. The one who owed me. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice warm with surprise and hope. Sarah? God, it's been what, 2 years? How are you? Hey, Marcus. Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, I found this amazing trail in Salem. You should visit before Halloween. You should visit I know you love October. The lie came easier than I'd expected. Marcus had always been fascinated by New England's history, by ghost stories and supernatural legends. He'd spent our entire relationship dragging me to allegedly haunted locations, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal. Salem would be irresistible to him. Really? That sounds incredible. You know me and spooky stuff. What's the place called? Salem Woods. There's this whole folklore thing about it. Rules carved into trees. Very atmospheric. Perfect for your photography. He arrived the next morning. eager to reconnect, hoping for closure. Marcus looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago, sandy hair falling over green eyes, that slightly crooked smile that had first attracted me in college. He carried the same expensive camera equipment that had been his passion back in Phoenix, and his excitement about exploring Salem's supernatural landscape was genuine and infectious. For a moment, watching him unpack his rental car outside my apartment, I almost called it off. Almost told him the truth about what waited in the woods. But then I remembered David Martinez's face as he lay in the street, remembered the way Marcus had helped me craft the story we told the police, remembered how we'd both sworn never to speak of those crucial seconds before the impact. Marcus owed me. We both knew it. I sent him to find Rule 7. I gave him precise directions to the trail, marked his map with the locations of the first 6 rules, told him exactly what to look for. I made it sound like a treasure hunt, an adventure designed specifically for someone with his interests. The woods would do the rest. He never came back. The police found his rental car 3 days later, parked at the woods entrance with his camera equipment still inside. The memory cards were blank, as if they'd never been used. Marcus Miller was listed as a missing person, another name added to Salem's long catalog of October disappearances. But I knew where he was. Every night since, I'd dreamed of him walking the endless paths, carrying his useless cameras, trying to document phenomena that existed beyond the reach of technology. Another ghost joining the procession of the lost, forever seeking exits that would never appear. The woods sent me a message that night, carved into my apartment door. Debt paid, but the woods remember, we're always listening. I moved away from Salem the next week, but here's the thing. Every October, I dream of those woods. I see Marcus walking the endless paths. I hear him calling my name, and sometimes, I swear I can feel trees listening to my thoughts. Even here in Portland, the dreams are always the same. I'm walking through Salem woods on one of those perfect October mornings, golden light filtering through the canopy, mist rising from the forest floor. But as I walk, I notice Marcus in the distance, photographing trees that shift and change when he's not looking directly at them. He waves at me, calls my name, asks me to pose for a picture, and I always want to answer. Want to go to him, to explain, to somehow make amends, but Rule 3 echoes in my memory. If you hear your name called, do not answer. Even in dreams, even when the voice belongs to someone I condemn to an eternity of wandering, I bite my tongue and force myself to stay silent. Because Rule 7, the real Rule 7, it doesn't just apply to Salem woods. It applies to every forest, every trail, every place where nature is older than human memory. The woods are always listening, and now that you've heard this story, now that you know the rules, they're listening to you too. Pay attention next time you're alone on a trail. Notice how the birds go quiet sometimes, how the path seems to stretch when you're in a hurry, how certain trees feel like they're watching. You'll tell yourself it's just your imagination, that it's just a stench or you heard online. But deep down you'll wonder, and that wonder, that tiny seed of belief, that's all the woods need, sweet dreams. And if you hear your name called in the darkness tonight, whatever you do, don't answer, pause for effect, still with me. Good. Hit that subscribe button if this story gave you chills. Comment below if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the woods. And remember, every October the rules appear, different each year except for one. The woods are always listening, even now. Even to you, share this story if you dare. But be warned, everyone who hears it becomes part of the game. And games in Salem woods, they never really end. But there's something else I need to tell you. Something I discovered after I moved to Portland, something that makes this whole story even worse. I thought I was safe here, 3,000 miles from Salem. I thought the woods' influence was limited to that particular patch of Massachusetts forest. I was wrong. Last month, walking through Forest Park on a crisp October morning, I found them again. 7 trees marked with fresh carvings. Different rules, same symbols. The same circle with 7 radiating lines carved above each message. Rule 1P. The forest network remembers all debts. Rule 2. Distance means nothing to roots that touch. Rule 3. Every forest speaks the same language. Rule 4. What you feed in one place grows in all places. Rule 5. The debt travels with the debtor. Rule 6. New woods, old hunge. Same rules. And Rule 7. Rule 7 was the same as always. The woods are always listening. You can run to any forest in any city in any country. We are all connected. We are all one. Welcome back to the game. I haven't been back to Forest Park since, but I can feel them calling. Every October morning I wake up with the urge to walk through the trees, to find that perfect trail that promises peace and solitude. The addiction the Salem woods instilled in me hasn't faded, it's grown stronger. Because that's what I finally understood about Rule 7. It's not just that the woods are always listening. It's that once you've fed a forest, your thoughts, your guilt, your secrets, you become part of a network that spans the entire world. Every forest becomes Salem Woods. Every trail becomes a potential trap. The rules don't just appear in Salem every October. They appear everywhere for everyone who's played the game and lost, or won, depending on your perspective. So when you're out there on your next hike, remember my story. Remember Marcus, walking forever through dimensions that exist between the trees. Remember that the most beautiful trails often lead to the darkest places, and remember that somewhere out there in forests you've never seen, my name is carved into trees alongside thousands of others, all of us bound by the same rules, all of us part of the same endless game. The woods are always listening, and they're listening to you right now. Story number 2. My grandmother's handwriting hasn't changed in the 3 years since she died. That's what I kept telling myself as I stared at the envelope in my trembling hands. The cursive loops, the way she dotted her eyes with tiny hearts, even the slight smudge where her left hand dragged across wet ink, all of it exactly the same. But that's impossible, right? If you're listening to this, you probably think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But before you judge me, let me ask you something. Have you ever received a letter that made your blood run cold? Not because of what it said, but because of who sent it? Comment below if you've ever gotten mail that shouldn't exist, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. Let me tell you how it started, and I promise you by the end of this story, you'll be checking your own mailbox differently. Part 1, the first letter. The story begins now. It was a Wednesday in October when everything changed. I remember because Wednesdays were grocery days in our small town of Millbrook, Vermont. Population 28047, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. I'd just moved back home after Mom's stroke. The old Victorian house on Maple Street felt too big, too empty, but someone had to take care of her. Dad had been gone since I was 12, and my sister Rachel lived in California with her perfect husband and her perfect kids, so it fell to me, Emma Henderson. 32, recently divorced, failed artist, now full-time caregiver. That morning started like any other. Mom was having a good day, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, watching the leaves fall. She couldn't speak anymore, but her eyes still tracked movement. Sometimes I swore she was trying to tell me something with those eyes. I was making her lunch when I heard it. The mailbox. That specific metallic creak it made when opened. "Mail's here, Mom," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. Our regular mail carrier, Bob, had retired last month. Heart problems, I'd heard. The new carrier was different. I'd only seen her once from a distance, a tall woman in the standard USPS uniform, but she always wore this old-fashioned hat, like something from the 1940s. And she only delivered on Wednesdays. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked to the front door. The October air bit at my skin, sharp like winter was lurking just around the corner. Our mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, and I could see a single envelope inside, no return address. Just my name in that achingly familiar handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. The paper inside was yellowed like it had aged decades in days. And the words, "My dearest Emma, I know this will frighten you, but please don't be afraid. Death isn't what we thought it was. It's more like moving to a different room in the same house. I can still see you, sweet girl. I see how you care for your mother. I see how lonely you are. The Wednesday carrier agreed to help me. She's been doing this work for people like me, people who left things unsaid. There are rules, of course. I can only write on Wednesdays, only one letter per week, and I can only tell you things you need to know. You need to know this. Check the attic. Behind the old wardrobe. Your grandfather left something there in 1962, something your mother needs. All my love, Grandma Rose P.S. Tell your mother I forgive her. She'll understand." The letter fell from my numb fingers. A gust of wind tried to steal it, but I snatched it back. My rational mind screamed that this was a prank, a cruel joke. But my heart recognized every curve of those letters. I looked back at the house. Mom was still at the window, but now she was staring right at me, and for the first time since her stroke, she was crying. Part 2, the attic. I didn't go to the attic right away. For 3 days, I carried that letter in my pocket, pulling it out every few hours to confirm it was real. The paper grew soft from handling, but the words never changed. Mom grew agitated. She'd point at the ceiling with her good hand, making sounds I couldn't understand. Her eyes would follow me desperately. On Saturday night, she refused to eat, just kept pointing up, up, up. Finally, on Tuesday evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The attic stairs groaned under my weight. No one had been up here in years. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight like tiny ghosts. The air tasted stale, forgotten. The wardrobe stood against the far wall, a massive oak thing that probably weighed 300 pounds. I had to use a crowbar to move it, inch by painful inch. Behind it, just as the letter said, was a small leather box. Inside, photographs, dozens of them, all of my mother as a young woman. But in every photo, she was with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark-haired, with kind eyes. They looked in love. At the bottom of the box was a birth certificate. My hands went cold. Rachel Marie Torres, born January 15, 1988, my sister's name, her exact birth date, but the father's name, it wasn't Dad's. I sat there in that dusty attic, piecing together a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. Mom had another man before Dad. Rachel wasn't Dad's biological daughter, and somehow Grandma Rose had known all along. The next morning, Wednesday, I waited by the mailbox. The mail carrier came at exactly 2:17 p.m. I saw her clearly this time. She was maybe 60, with silver hair tucked under that vintage hat. Her uniform was standard USPS, but something about her felt older, like she'd stepped out of a different era. She smiled at me as she approached. Not a happy smile, more like understanding. "You must be Emma," she said. Her voice had a strange quality, soft but carrying, like whispers in an empty church. "How do you know my name?" "I know all my recipients' names." She handed me another letter. "Your grandmother talks about you often." "My grandmother is dead." "Yes," she said it simply, matter-of-factly. "That's why she needs me." I wanted to grab her, shake her, demand answers, but something in her eyes stopped me. They were gray, but not just gray. They were the color of fog over graveyards, the color of between. "How?" was all I managed. "Every town has one," she said, adjusting her mailbag. "One carrier who delivers the last words, the messages that couldn't be sent in life. Wednesday is my day, always has been since 1947. "That's impossible. You'd have to be 93 next March," she smiled again. "The job keeps me young, or perhaps it keeps me necessary." She started to walk away, then paused. "Emma? Your mother knows about the letters. She's been waiting for them her whole life. Her father, the man in those photos, he wrote to her every Wednesday for 40 years. Your grandmother never let her see them. Check the basement, southwest corner." Under the loose floorboard. Then she was gone, not walking away, but just gone, like she'd never been there at all. The new letter felt heavier than the first. "Emma, you found the photos. Good. Your mother needs to know. She was loved. Her real father, Miguel, died in Vietnam 3 weeks before she was born. I convinced her to marry your father for stability, for respectability. It was 1969, things were different then, but I was wrong. Love matters more than reputation. Your mother spent her whole life thinking she wasn't enough because your father couldn't love her the way Miguel did. And your father, he knew. He always knew Rachel wasn't his. It poisoned everything. The letters in the basement will explain everything. But Emma, there's something else. Something about you. You've been having the dreams, haven't you? The ones where you're underwater but you can breathe? Where you hear voices calling your name? There's a reason the Wednesday carrier came to you. A reason you can see her clearly while others can't. You have the gift, sweet girl. Just like I did. Just like my mother before me. Next Wednesday, the carrier will have a choice for you. Listen carefully. Love, Grandma Rose. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the letter. The dreams, how could she know about the dreams? I'd been having them since I moved back home. Dreams where I was floating in dark water surrounded by whispers. Dreams where letters floated past me like fish, their words glowing in the darkness. I'd wake up gasping, tasting salt and ink. I ran to the basement. Part 3, the letters below. The basement had always scared me as a child. Something about the way sound died down there, like the walls swallowed noise. Mom never let us play there. Now I understood why. The southwest corner was behind the old furnace. I had to crawl through spider webs and decades of dust. The floorboard came up easily, too easily, too easily. Like it had been lifted recently. Inside, a wooden box, locked. I broke it open with a hammer. Letters, hundreds of them. All addressed to my beloved Anna, my mother's name. All in the same masculine handwriting, all dated Wednesday. The first one was from 1970, my darling Anna, you won't remember me. You were so small when I left for the war. But I remember you. Your first laugh, your first steps, the way you reached for me when you were scared. I'm gone from your world now, but not gone completely. The Wednesday carrier has given me this gift, 1 letter a week to watch you grow. Even if you never read these, I need you to know you were wanted. You were loved. You are perfect exactly as you are. Your father, Miguel, I read them all, every single one. Letters tracking my mother's life. Her first day of school. Her high school graduation. Her wedding day, that one was stained with what looked like tears. The day Rachel was born, the day I was born, the last letter was dated just 1 week before Mom's stroke. Anna, I've watched you become a grandmother. I've seen your strength, your kindness, your sacrifice. But I've also seen your sadness. The way you stare at nothing sometimes, like you're looking for something you lost. You didn't lose it, my love. It was taken from you. Your mother thought she was protecting you, but she was wrong. These letters were always meant for you. The Wednesday carrier tells me our time is running short. That soon, very soon, you'll be able to hear me yourself. The veil is thinning for you, Anna. Don't be afraid when it happens. I'll be waiting on the other side of Wednesday. Forever your father, Miguel. I sat in that basement, surrounded by 40 years of love letters from a dead man to his daughter, and I finally understood. Mom's stroke, it hadn't just taken her speech, it had opened something in her. That's why she could see things we couldn't. Why she stared at empty corners of rooms. Why she sometimes smiled at nothing. She was already halfway between worlds. I gathered all the letters and brought them upstairs. Mom was in her chair, facing the window, but when I entered, she turned to me, slowly, deliberately. I placed the letters in her lap. For the first time in 6 months, my mother smiled, really smiled. She touched the letters with her good hand, then brought one to her face. She couldn't read anymore, the stroke had taken that too, but she didn't need to read them. She knew. That night, Mom slept peacefully for the first time since coming home from the hospital. And I had the dream again. But this time, in the dark water, I wasn't alone. Grandma Rose was there, young and beautiful, and beside her stood a man in uniform. "Miguel, she's coming," Grandma Rose said. "Your mother, soon. But Emma, you have a choice to make." "What choice?" "The Wednesday carrier is retiring. She needs a replacement. Someone who can walk between worlds. Someone who understands that death isn't an ending, just a change of address." I woke up gasping. It was 3:33 a.m. Wednesday Part 4, The Choice. That Wednesday, I didn't wait by the mailbox. I sat with Mom instead, holding her hand, reading Miguel's letters aloud. Her eyes followed every word, tears streaming down her face. Happy tears. Finally, happy tears. At exactly 2:17 p.m., the doorbell rang. The Wednesday carrier stood on our porch, but she looked different. Older, more transparent, like she was fading at the edges. "It's time," she said. Mom made a sound, not quite a word, but close. She squeezed my hand once, then let go. "Not for her," the carrier clarified. "For you, to choose." She held out 2 envelopes, one white, one black. The white envelope contains a letter from your grandmother, one last message, then no more. You'll live your life never hearing from the other side again, ordinary, safe, normal. And the black envelope contains an appointment. Every Wednesday you'll walk the route. You'll deliver messages from those who've crossed over to those who remain. You'll age slower, see clearer, live between worlds. But Emma, you'll never fully belong to either. I looked at Mom. She was pointing at the black envelope. Of course she was. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked the carrier. "Since my husband died in World War II. He had so much to say, and I had so much to hear. The previous carrier taught me the route. Now I teach you. Why me? Because you have the gift. Because you understand loss. But mostly, because you believe. Not everyone who gets a letter believes it's real. You did, from the very first word. I thought about my empty life, my failed marriage, my abandoned art. What was I really leaving behind? If I take the job, can I still write, still paint?" She smiled. "Child, you'll have more stories than you'll know what to do with. Every letter is a life. Every delivery is a reunion. You'll create art from the space between heartbeats, from the pause between breathing in and breathing out." Inside was a single line. "Route begins next Wednesday. Uniform will arrive Tuesday. Welcome to the service." The moment I touched it, everything changed. The world got brighter and dimmer at the same time. I could see threads, silver threads connecting everything. One ran from Mom to the window. I followed it with my eyes and saw him. Miguel, young, handsome, in uniform, waiting. "Mom," I whispered, "he's here." She saw him too. I know she did. Because she smiled wider than I'd seen in years. And then, gently, quietly, like stepping from one room to another, she left. Not died, left. I saw her stand up from her body, young again, walking toward Miguel. They embraced, and just before they faded, she turned to me. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear as day. The former carrier, put her hand on my shoulder. "The first delivery is always the hardest," she said. "But also the most important." She handed me a letter. It was addressed to me in Mom's handwriting. "My dearest Emma, by the time you read this, I'll be with Dad, my real dad. And your father, he's here too. He wants you to know he's sorry, for the distance, for the drinking, for not knowing how to love a daughter who reminded him so much of what he'd lost. But Emma, this isn't goodbye. Not really. It's just, see you on Wednesday. Take care of the route. Take care of the letters. There are so many people who need to say goodbye properly. So many who need to say hello one more time. The basement is yours now. That's where the letters come. Every Tuesday night at midnight. Sort them by address. Deliver them with care. And remember, you're not just carrying paper. You're carrying love across the veil. Until Wednesday, Mom, P.S." Rachel will get her first letter next month. Be gentle when you deliver it. She doesn't believe like you do. Not yet. That was 3 months ago. Now, every Wednesday I walk the route. Millbrook has 17 stops, 17 people waiting for word from the other side. Mrs. Patterson gets letters from her son who died in Iraq. Tommy Martinez hears from his grandmother who raised him. Sarah Chen receives recipes from her mother, each one containing a secret message of love. And me? I get letters too, from Mom, from Grandma Rose. Even one from Dad, apologizing, explaining, trying to make peace with his own jealousy and pain. Part 5, learning the route those first few weeks as the new Wednesday carrier were overwhelming. Eleanor Whitmore, that was the former carrier's name, spent 3 Wednesdays teaching me the route before she finally crossed over herself. Each delivery is different, she told me as we walked down Elm Street on my second Wednesday. Some people cry, some refuse to take the letter. Some slam the door. But Emma, you must deliver every letter. That's the promise we make. She was right about the reactions. Mr. Henderson, no relation despite the name, threw his letter back at me when I told him it was from his deceased wife. She's been gone 10 years, he shouted. I don't need this sick joke. But his wife's letter found its way back to his mailbox the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes the messages insist on being received. Eleanor had warned me. By the 4th time it appeared, Mr. Henderson was waiting for me. How? He whispered, clutching the envelope. Love finds a way, I said, borrowing Eleanor's phrase. He read it right there on his porch, tears streaming down his weathered face. Inside was an address, his wife's sister in Portland, Oregon, a woman he'd lost touch with after the funeral. The letter explained that his wife had hidden some money in their bedroom wall, enough to visit her sister one last time. He found the money exactly where she said it would be. The hardest delivery was Rachel's letter. I had to drive to California, taking a week of vacation from my old life to make the trip. My sister lived in a pristine suburban house with a manicured lawn and matching Honda Pilots in the driveway. She looked good, successful, happy, everything I'd never been. Emma, she hugged me at the door. What a surprise. Come in, come in. How's Mom? Is everything okay? I couldn't tell her Mom was gone, not yet. Instead, I sat in her perfect living room and tried to explain about the letters. You're scaring me, she said, backing away. Emma, have you been? Are you taking medication? Since the divorce? I pulled out her letter. It was thick, multiple pages. The return address read Miguel Torres. Rachel's face went white. That's not possible. Torres was Mom's maiden name before she married Dad. Read it, I said quietly. She did. All 4 pages. By the end, she was sobbing. My beloved daughter, I died 3 weeks before you were born. I never got to hold you, never got to tell you how much I already loved you, but I've watched you grow from here. Every birthday, every accomplishment, every moment of joy and sorrow. Your real name is Rachel Marie Torres. You are my daughter, not just Anna's. The man who raised you did his best, but he could never love you the way I do. That wasn't your fault, Maya. It was fear. You have a grandmother still living in San Antonio, Maria Torres. She's 91 now, and she's been waiting to meet you her whole life. Anna's mother forbade any contact, but those rules don't apply anymore. In the envelope, you'll find her address and phone number. Also, there's something that belongs to you. I was wearing it when I died. The Army sent it home, and your grandmother has kept it safe all these years. Call her. She has stories to tell you, stories about our family, our culture, our language, things you should have known your whole life. You are not alone, Rachel. You never were. Con amor infinito, your father, Miguel. The envelope also contained a small velvet pouch. Inside was a gold chain with a medal, St. Christopher, patron of travelers. Rachel called her grandmother that night. They talked for 3 hours. She flew to San Antonio the following weekend. 6 months later, Rachel moved her family to Texas. She's learning Spanish, cooking traditional Mexican food. Her kids are bilingual now, carrying on traditions they never knew they had. She writes to me sometimes, real letters on real paper. She says she understands now why I took the job. Part 6, the deeper rules. As the months passed, I learned more about the service. It wasn't just about delivering letters. There were deeper rules, older purposes. Every Tuesday night at midnight, I'd go to the basement. The letters would appear on the old wooden table, sorted by some unseen hand. But it wasn't random. There was a pattern. Some letters were urgent, bright white paper that felt warm to the touch. These were for people in immediate crisis, about to make life-changing decisions. Mrs. Patterson's son warned her about her boyfriend's gambling addiction just days before she was planning to marry him. Some letters were golden, literally. The paper seemed to shimmer. These were for people who'd given up hope entirely. Tommy Martinez was planning to end his life when his grandmother's letter appeared, telling him about the scholarship fund she'd secretly established before she died. He'd been denied college due to his family's financial situation, but the fund had enough to pay for 4 years. And some letters were transparent, barely visible. These were the hardest ones. Letters for people who weren't ready to believe, who needed gentle preparation for the truth. I also learned about the boundaries. I couldn't deliver letters outside my assigned territory without permission from other carriers. Each region had its guardian, its Wednesday walker. We were connected but separate, like postal zones for the afterlife. Once a year, all the carriers met. There were more of us than I'd expected, maybe 30 across New England. We gathered at a lighthouse in Maine that only existed on Wednesdays. Some carriers had been walking their routes for centuries. Others were newcomers like me. The oldest was a woman named Constance Hartwell. She'd been carrying messages since the Salem witch trials of 1692. She was the one who explained the true purpose of our work. Death creates tears in the fabric, she said, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. Unfinished business, unspoken words, they leave holes between the worlds. If these holes grow too large, the boundary between life and death begins to break down. Our job isn't just kindness, Emma, it's maintenance. We're keeping the two worlds properly separate while allowing love to bridge the gap. That's when I understood why I could see the silver threads, why the world looked different now. I wasn't just delivering mail. I was weaving reality back together, one letter at a time. The work changed me in other ways too. My art returned, but transformed. I painted portraits of my recipients now, not their living faces, but their souls. Each painting captured the moment they received their letter, the instant when love reached across death to touch them again. My gallery in Burlington started selling them. People said they were hauntingly beautiful, that looking at them made you believe in miracles. They didn't know how literally true that was. But here's the thing, and this is why I'm telling you this story. Last week, I got a letter with no name, just an address. Your address, the one you're sitting at right now, listening to this. Someone on the other side has something to tell you, something important, something that couldn't be said in life. This Wednesday, check your mailbox at 2:17 p.m. Look for the woman in the vintage hat. Don't be afraid when you see her. She's just doing her job. A job I'll do until someone else needs it more. And when you get your letter, when you read those impossible words in that familiar handwriting, remember this: death isn't the opposite of life. It's just life's change of address. And love, real love, always finds a way to deliver its message, even if it takes a Wednesday carrier to do it. So I have to ask you, and please, leave your answer in the comments below. Have you been dreaming of someone lately, someone who's gone? Because if you have, they might be trying to tell you something. And if you hear a knock at 2:17 on a Wednesday, answer it. You never know what message is waiting for you from the other side of Wednesday.